I have the honor to inform Your Excellency that I yesterday took possession of Fort William Henry, and this morning at daybreak, the English army began its march. Unfortunately, many of the savages, excited by the liquor found in the fort, have become uncontrollable. I fear that some regrettable actions have taken place. This was General Louis Joseph de Montcalm to the Marquis de Vaudreuil, August 10th, 1757.
Welcome back to APUSH for All. Today we've got a special episode that takes us to the forests of colonial New York. Not through any textbook reading or maps or DBQs, but through the 1992 film The Last of the Mohicans. Make no mistake, this isn't your average movie review. We're here to help APUSH students decode historical themes, narratives, and inaccuracies embedded in this cinematic drama.
And while this film is loosely based off of James Fenimore Cooper's novel, and it's set during the French and Indian War, we're going to peel back the layers to explore what it reveals and what it distorts about empire, Native American relations, frontier life, and identity in 18th century America.
So we're going to start with the context of the war itself, break down the film's key characters, especially those who never actually existed, and then look at what the story tells us about American memory and myth-making. And finally, we'll connect all this to the themes in APUSH that students are often tested on or need to know about, power, identity, conflict, continuity, all that's there and more as we watch Last Mohicans.
And I just want to say, if you hate this episode, blame Dr. Garrison, because after the APUSH test, which is come and gone, each of us gets to pick a film that our classes will watch. This was Dr. Garrison's pick.
Yeah, I think it's a great pick. Daniel Day-Lewis, I mean, come on.
Method.
He's pretty easy on the eyes, too.
A great actor, and it's based on one of the most popular novels in American history. So pretty apropos, I would say.
Say it in a French accent.
Pretty apropos.
Oh, ho, ho. So let's start with the setting. The French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War globally, was fought between 1754 and 1763. It was fundamentally a war for empire between Britain and France. But it's important to emphasize that the French and Indian War wasn't just a contest between European empires. It was also a very complex and deeply consequential struggle for native nations. Many indigenous groups, like the Haudenosaunee Confederation, wow, better known as the Iroquois, the Huron, the Algonquins, and the Abenaki, didn't simply choose sides out of loyalty. They made calculated decisions based on what they believed would best protect their land, their political autonomy, and their own survival.
Yeah, so for example, the Iroquois Confederacy largely tried to remain neutral, try to play both sides, employing what historians call kind of this middle ground diplomacy, but neutrality was almost impossible as the violence between the French and the British began to escalate. A part of the Iroquois Confederacy was the Mohawk tribe, and eventually they will actually tilt toward the British because their fear was that the French expansion would influence their relations in the Ohio River Valley. But then the Huron and many Algonquin-speaking groups, they decided to go with the French, whom they had long-standing trade relationships with. So oftentimes it came down to, for each individual tribe or confederacy, which side, French or British, offered the best opportunity for success and survival.
And we really have to stress that for our students, and for our listeners, APUSH for all, that these alliances were about sovereignty. It's about power. Native groups, they were not pawns. They were independent political actors, and they weighed risks. They negotiated treaties. They constantly shifted strategies now that, since the 1600s in this part of America, and earlier the late 1400s and 1500s, they have these new encounters with Europeans now. So they have to adjust to that. And many tribes, expected that whichever European power won, their own interests would be secured through those alliances. What they couldn't foresee, though, was that both empires ultimately viewed their own continent as Europeans, ability to divide.
Yeah, and so
I struggled with that.
you know what? We
It's
all
okay.
struggle. It's okay.
Let's let everyone.
Some of us struggled on the APUSH exam. Probably not very many of you, because if you listened to our podcast, you probably aced it.
Right, but you might have stumbled a bit, as Miss Keltner so clearly did right there.
Yeah.
It's
It's
okay.
okay. It's really okay.
Yeah.
I thought we're really supportive of each other, I feel
Thank
like.
you.
And this ties directly into the APUSH theme of politics and power. Native diplomacy during this period reveals how indigenous peoples were asserting political agency even as they faced growing European encroachment. Their actions shaped the course of the war and its aftermath. I think about all the way back to when we talked about Powhatan and Pocahontas in class. I mean, there were very deliberate goings on the part of the natives that were trying to set themselves up as, um, you know, holding on to whatever sovereignty that they had. So, to your point, Ms. Keltner, about indigenous folks were not simply pawns to be played.
And when we mentioned the aftermath, so the aftermath for Native peoples was pretty devastating. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763 that officially ended the French and Indian War in North America, the negotiations were held entirely by European powers, primarily Britain and France, and Spain was in there a little bit too, but there was no room at the table for native nations. So despite the fact that they played an incredibly important role in the outcome of the war, they get no say in how things will be cut up and divided in the aftermath. And instead, their land will be basically parceled out in these diplomatic back rooms, and these are entirely European back rooms. So when we talk about this war laying the groundwork for future conflicts, there's going to be Pontiac's Rebellion, the Proclamation of 1763, and then eventually the American Revolution. We're seeing the fallout of a dynamic power shift between the Native American nations, and their hopes for what they thought the world was going to look like in this post-contact period. All right, so let's take a step back and set the stage, set the table, if you will.
Oh.
The film opens. We've got this lush, rugged wilderness of upstate New York, 1757. Right. Eventually, transcendentalism will come to see this as the beautiful Hudson Valley for artists and poets and.
Well, I don't know why you had to bring the transcendentalists into this, but I do love that opening scene of those lush mountains, and then you've got the scene with the little cabin, and it's got, the fire going and the smoke's coming out. It just looks really, when you forget about the disease that was rampant, when you forget about the, traumatizing attacks between both colonists and natives, when you forget that women had no rights, when you forget about all of that, it really is a beautiful scene.
Yeah, not hard for me. I can do that. I can get there.
Bucolic.
Bucolic. Idyllic.
Is the word.
Bucolic is the word of the episode.
Oh, bucolic.
Bucolic.
Okay, good.
Bucolic.
Are you going to say it in your ASMR?
Bucolic.
That was pretty good.
Who's that?
That was good. And now, so we have this opening scene, and it's also important to note that in the opening scene, they are tracking a deer, right? And so this is to let us know that animal fur, animal skins are currency. That this is the height of the fur trade, although it's starting to fade out in this region. The British and the French, though, they're not just fighting for the fur trade, they're not even just fighting for territory, they're hoping to control the trade of all of North America. And so in these opening scenes, we meet our main characters. Daniel Day-Lewis plays Nathaniel. In the books, he's sometimes referred to as Hawkeye, Natty Bumpus. There's all kinds of names that he goes by. But in the movie,
Wait, I think it's Natty Bumpo.
Bumpo.
But you know where Bumpus comes from?
Where?
The Bumpus Hounds.
Yeah, A Christmas Story.
A Christmas Story.
Oh, so that's
Right.
what
You know what? Throw those hounds in there, and then you've got a real story.
Yeah, this is great.
Sons of blanking bumpuses.
That's how we got to a Christmas story, talking about the French Indian War. Okay, so Daniel Day-Lewis is Nathaniel. He's raised by the Mohican chief Chingachgook
Mm-hmm.
and his son Uncas. These are the last of the Mohicans. This is the eponymous characters here in the story, and they're hunting and they're running through the forest, and it's very dangerous and volatile, and that's where we pick up.
Yes, and it really is going to kick the plot into motion. And then, of course, on the British side, we've got British Colonel Monroe. He is stationed at Fort William Henry, and he's Scottish, so they refer to him as the Scot. And he also has gray hair, so sometimes they refer to him as gray hair, the natives do. And Fort William Henry is a very strategic post on the southern end of Lake George in New York, and he's ordered to hold the fort against a French siege led by General Montcalm, the French general. And so meanwhile, his daughters, Cora and Alice Monroe, they're traveling through the wilderness to reach him, and they're going to be escorted by a British officer named Duncan Hayward, and then a Huron guide named Magua.
Now here's where the drama turns tragic. Magua, we soon learn, is no loyal guide. He harbors a deep personal grudge against Colonel Monroe, or the gray hair, for past wrongs, specifically for having ordered his family killed during a prior conflict. That'll probably do it. And for forcibly removing him from his people. Magua leads the party into an ambush, and it's Hawkeye, Uncas, and Chingachgook who rescue the Monroe sisters. This creates the bond and the love triangle that anchors the rest of the film.
The love triangle is so good between the British General Hayward, and he asks Cora Monroe to marry him because they're, like old friends from, Britain. And he's like, in one of the opening scenes, so I think it'd be great if we get married. And she's just immediately, no.
Friend zone.
And that's what somebody said in class. They're like, friend zone. I'm like, denied.
And you also heard a little bit of Femme Covert, because he's like, I'll take care of all of your needs. We'll be the best couple. You won't have to do anything. I'll just take control of everything.
Yeah, and if you can't make this decision on your own, you need to talk to your father, who has your best interests in mind. Like, she isn't capable of thinking on her own. Yeah, right, Hayward.
Let's just see what Cora's capable of. Let's see what happens. The story builds. We see a deteriorating situation at the historically real Fort William Henry, real fort, French Indian War. The British are under siege. They're running low on supplies. They're waiting for reinforcements, but General Webb never sends them. There's a miscommunication. Oh boy. And ultimately, Monroe, the Scots, the men, the gray hair, is forced to surrender to Montcalm, and under the condition that the British garrison and civilians will be allowed to leave peacefully with honor.
How do you guys say Britain?
Britain.
So there's that like kind of hidden T, but it's kind of, so some of my kids in class say Britain, and they don't say the T at all. And then the middle way is Britain, the way we three say it. And then there's Britain. Boom.
Yeah.
So I was just curious.
Yeah.
So that's the historical event that the film climaxes around, is this surrender of the fort. And what happens next? In the film, as the British march away under the white flag, Magua and his Huron allies ambush the retreating column in a scene that is harrowing and emotional. It's portrayed as a bloody betrayal and massacre, chaotic, personal, and brutal.
But here's where us nerdy historians have to say, like, oh, well, wait, actually,
that was a good one.
Yeah, with putting the glasses up. Well, actually.
Let me stop you right there. There was a massacre. The reality was more complicated than what's shown on screen. So Montcalm had given his word to protect the British, but many of his native allies felt betrayed because they had from the beginning been promised the spoils of war. They had been promised prisoners. And this is traditional native warfare. Part of the reason you go to war is to take prisoners, is to take resources. And they saw the British just kind of being allowed to leave. These are their enemies, and they're leaving, taking their supplies. And there was some anger and some miscommunication. The French tried and mostly failed to restrain their allies. And what followed was really just a breakdown of discipline, rooted, though, in cultural misunderstanding and unmet expectations.
Yeah, this is a classic example of a clash of worldviews. In native warfare, taking captives was very customary, even honorable. But in European tradition at this time, surrender terms like those agreed at Fort William Henry didn't account for that. And you hear in the film, each general refers to the other one as gentlemanly and not as barbaric. So when the French marched their former enemies out without sharing spoils or captives, um, or not sharing, but without taking any spoils or captives, many native warriors saw that as a betrayal.
So yeah, while the film dramatizes the event with Magua personally orchestrating this like massacre for revenge, and that makes it all very cool story, it really simplifies the deeper political and cultural dynamics that APUSH students should be able to recognize and understand. And this is a moment where cinematic narrative diverges from historical complexity, because historically figures like Magua, the Huron warriors, there was a complex series of motives behind their decision making, and many indigenous nations that were allied with the French, they did it not necessarily out of a hatred for the British, but because French diplomacy often respected their autonomy way more than British colonial expansion did.
And this is a point students should really sit with. The French and Indian War wasn't just British versus French, it was a multinational war, and Native American nations played critical roles. That aligns directly with APUSH's CEDs, their themes of politics and power, America in the world, and culture and society.
And let's not forget gender here. Cora Monroe, who the men at the beginning of the film didn't think she could make decisions for herself, she defies 18th century expectations, just like so many women do, defying expectations. And her character, it challenged the domestic ideal, and it's central to the racial and romantic tensions in this story. James Fenimore Cooper originally wrote her sister Alice as the romantic lead, but the filmmakers shifted it to Cora, who's often portrayed as being of mixed race in literary interpretations. So I think this creative decision alone opens a window in discussions of race and identity in early America.
We also have to note the film's glaring inaccuracies. So, for example, Nathaniel is entirely fictional. The Mohican tribe was not literally down to just two people by 1757. I mean, in fact, the Mohican, it's a distinct group, but it's sort of lumped in with the Mohicans, they still exist today. So while the movie sort of trades on themes of extinction, the reality is it's more of survival, adaptation, and resistance.
And there's also the portrayal of native life. The film leans heavily into the noble savage trope. Dignified, spiritual, but ultimately doomed. It offers very little of the complexity, political savvy, or cultural depth of native societies in the Northeast at the time.
Which really makes this a perfect opportunity for a classroom discussion or just a discussion amongst peers, who are interested in this time period or in this movie. What can you learn about early America from popular culture? How do films shape historical memory? The historical memory is the way that we in the present view the past. And how can we as historians and student historians or, as, what's the word I'm looking for?
Amateur history?
Amateur historians. Yeah. How can we interrogate those portrayals? And for me, the way that I got into history, honestly, was through film when I was a kid. And so, film is really important for capturing amateur historians, I think, and professional historians. So, that's why we love to dive into some famous films at the end of the year to capture imagination and to look at, what's truth and what's, more sort of fiction.
So this leads us right to the present. Let's think about the way Last Mohicans plays into the larger American mythos. The rugged individualist, the disappearing Indian, the untamable wilderness. These themes didn't end with James Fenimore Cooper. They show up in how we remember the frontier, the monuments that we make, the education, the things that we teach, and even in our modern day politics. But let's pull back for a moment and talk just real quickly about James Fenimore Cooper, the man behind it all. The Last Mohicans was published in 1826. It is part of a larger series, the Leatherstocking Tales. And Cooper at the time was writing in a young republic that was still trying to define itself culturally, politically, and tried to do some myth making to sort of establish this idea of an American past. And his novels were some of the first attempts to create a distinctly American literature, one that sort of turned away from European aristocrats and instead it started looking to the West, to the frontier.
Exactly. And Cooper gave readers an American hero in Natty Bumppo, and the film reimagines him as Hawkeye. That's Daniel Day-Lewis.
Or Nathaniel, as they often call him.
Yeah, and he is self-reliant, he's virtuous for all my pushers out there, and importantly, he's always caught between civilizations, right? Between the indigenous culture that he was brought up into after his, family was all killed, but also white colonial society because he was white. And James Fenimore Cooper really romanticized Native Americans, especially through characters like Chingachgook and Uncas, but always within a framework of inevitable decline. And that's the limitation, right? Where even as James Fenimore Cooper celebrates their nobility, he treats native cultures as doomed. They're heroic, yes, but to him, they're also vanishing.
And that's where we, where we really see the myth of the noble savage come into play. Cooper helped popularize it for American audiences. The idea that Native people were brave, wise, and in tune with nature, yes, but also tragically incompatible with civilization. It's a myth that appears sympathetic, but it serves a very damaging purpose. It justifies dispossession. If indigenous people are destined to disappear, then their land and their future must belong to someone else.
And let's be clear, the film, like the novel, doesn't ever really grapple with what came before 1757. By the time we meet Uncas and Chingachgook, the Mohicans are already a last remnant. But that skips centuries of resistance, of adaptation, of trauma, of warfare. The Mohican and the Mohican and all the very real tribes of peoples were not just these passive victims of history. They had endured waves of disease, warfare, displacement, broken treaties, beginning with European colonization in the early 1600s.
And I think even before that, Native peoples had created incredibly diverse and advanced societies. Whether it was the Cahokia around the area where we live or the Iroquois Confederacy, we don't want to just look at them through these waves of trauma and disease and displacement, but also for the grandness that they were before their interactions with Europeans. And, the way the film treats Native disappearance I'm sorry, I always have trouble with this.
It's one of my favorite phrases, and in my head, I always say it correctly, but I'm too scared to say it out loud. I say, fait accompli.
Fait accompli.
Fait accompli.
Yeah.
Meaning that something is finished, right? So native disappearance is something that was finished. It's incredibly problematic. It lets viewers feel like this kind of nostalgic sadness without acknowledging the systems that created that loss. It's very sanitized, and the camera pans to Chingachgook mourning his son, saying he is, quote unquote, the last of the Mohicans, and it feels like closure, but in reality, there's no resolution, right? There's just erasure.
Ooh, that's well said.
Thank you.
And that's where APUSH students need to think critically. What happens now that the Mohicans are, quote unquote, gone, according to the narrative? The answer, historically, is settler expansion. It creates space, literally and symbolically, for manifest destiny, for white Americans to justify westward migration and the conquest of native land under the banner of inevitability. We've talked about this in past episodes, how frontier mythology supported everything from Indian removal to the Mexican-American War to American imperialism overseas.
And yet, and this is crucial, the Mohican people aren't actually gone. That's the lie or the misdirection. Because today, the Stockbridge Munsee community, a federally recognized tribe in Wisconsin, are direct descendants of the Mohican people from the Hudson River Valley. They were pushed westward by manifest destiny over many generations, first to Massachusetts, then New York, then to Indiana, and finally to Wisconsin, but they still exist, they govern, they speak, they remember.
Right, and this myth of disappearance persists in our popular culture, in textbooks, sports mascots, and Hollywood films. But Native nations today, they're not relics. They are sovereign entities. And one of the most important lessons that students can take from this episode is to challenge the idea that Native peoples only belong in the past, because history is not finished. And they're also not finished with history.
So what should APUSH students take from all this? First, that history in Hollywood is never neutral. The Last of the Mohicans is a beautifully made film, but it reflects 19th and 20th century myths about race, gender, empire, and identity.
Second, use what the film gets right as a launching point. The role of Native alliances in the French and Indian War, the importance of the war in leading to the American Revolution, and how colonial conflicts shaped American identity.
And finally, question the portrayals. Ask who's included, who's erased, and why that matters. That is historical thinking.
Very good. So thanks for tuning in to this very special episode of APUSH for All. I like to think of it as APUSH goes to the movies.
Yeah.
Love that.
How about that? If you liked the episode, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, or YouTube. Leave us a review. And if you got a topic you want us to cover, send us a message on Instagram at APUSH for All.
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.